Wires by John McGregor. It was a sugar beet, presumably, since that was a sugar beet lorry in front of her, and this thing turning in the air at something like 60 miles an hour had just fallen off it. It looked like a giant turnip and was covered in mud, and basically looked more or less like whatever she would have imagined a sugar beet to look like if she'd given it any thought before now, which she didn't think she had. It was totally filthy. They didn't make sugar out of that, did they? What did they do? Grind it? Cook it? Regardless, whatever. It was coming straight for her. Meaning this was, one of those time slows down moments or something. Her life was presumably going to start flashing in front of her eyes right about now. She wondered why she hadn't screamed or anything. Oh, seemed to be about as much as she'd managed, but in the time it had taken to say, oh, she'd apparently had the time to make a list of all the things she was having the time to think about, like, i.e., item 1, how she'd said, oh, without any panic or fear. And did that mean she was repressed, or just calm, or collected, or what? Item 2, what would Marcus say when he found out? Would he try and find someone to blame, such as herself for driving too close, or even for driving on her own at all? Or such as the lorry driver for overloading the lorry, or such as her, again, for not having joined the union like he told her to. Like anyone was in a union these days, especially anyone with a part-time job who was still at uni and not actually all that bothered about pension rights or legal representation. Item 3. But she couldn't possibly be thinking all this in the time it was taking for the sugar beet to turn in the air and crash through the window, if that's what it was going to do. And what then? Meaning this must be like a neural pathway illusion or something. Item 4. Actually, Marcus did go on sometimes. He really did reckon himself. And how come she thought things like that about him so often? Maybe she was being unfair because they were good together. People had told her they were good together. But basically, she was confused and she didn't know where she stood. Item 5. A witty and deadpan way of mentioning this on her status update would be something like, Emily Wilkinson is sweet enough already, thanks, without a sugar beet in the face. Although actually she wouldn't be able to put that if that's what was actually going to happen, thinking about it logically. Item 6. Although did she really even know what a neural pathway was? Or was it just something she'd heard someone else talk about and decided to start saying? Item 7 was just basically, what the fuck? Meanwhile, before she had time to do anything useful, like e.g. swerve or brake or duck or throw her arms up in front of her face, the sugar beet smashed through the windscreen and thumped into the passenger seat beside her. There was a roar of cold air. And now she swerved. Only now. Once there was no need and it just made things more dangerous. Into the middle lane and back again into the slow lane. It was totally instinctive and totally useless, and basically made her think of her great-granddad saying, God help us if there's a war on. She saw other people looking at her, or she thought she did, all shocked faces and big mouths. A woman pulling at her boyfriend's arm and pointing. A man swearing and reaching for his phone. Another man in a blue van waving her over to the hard shoulder. But she might have imagined this or invented it afterwards. Marcus was always saying that people didn't look at her as much as she thought they did. She never knew whether he meant this to reassure her or if he was saying she reckoned herself too much. Anyway, point being, status update. Emily Wilkinson is still alive. She pulled over to the hard shoulder and came to a stop. The blue van pulled over in front of her. She put her hazard lights on and listened to the clicking sound they made. When she looked up, the people in the passing cars already had no idea what had happened. The drama was over. The traffic was back to full speed. The lorry was already miles down the road. She wondered if she was supposed to start crying. She didn't feel like crying. Someone was standing next to the car. Bloody hell! he said. He peered in at her through the hole in the windscreen. He looked like a mechanic or a breakdown man or something. He was wearing a wax jacket with rips in the elbows and jeans. He looked tired. His eyes were puffy and dark, and his breathing was heavy. He rested his hand on the bonnet and leaned in closer. "Bloody hell!" he said again, raising his voice against the trap. "Are you all right, love?" She smiled and nodded and shrugged, which was weird, which meant was she for some reason apologizing for his concern. "Bloody hell," he said for a third time. "You could have been killed." "Thanks. Great. This was, what, news?" She looked down at the sugar beet, which was sitting on a heap of glass on the passenger seat beside her. The bits of glass were small and lumpy like gravel. She noticed more bits of glass on the floor and on the dashboard and spread across her lap. She noticed that her left arm was scratched and that she was still holding on to the steering wheel, and that maybe she wasn't breathing quite as much as she should have been. Although that happened whenever she thought about her breathing, it going wrong like that, too deep or too shallow or too quick, although that wasn't just her, though, surely. It was one of those well-known paradoxes, like a Buddhist thing or something. Total mindlessness, mindfulness. Just breathe. "The police are on their way," someone else said. She looked up and saw another man, a younger man in a sweatshirt and jeans, holding up a silver phone. "I just called the police," he said. "They're on their way." He seemed pleased to have a phone with him, the way he was holding it, like this was his first one or something, which there was no way. His jeans had grass stains on the knees and his boots were thick with mud. "You called them, did you?" the older man asked. The younger man nodded and put his phone in his pocket and looked at her. She sat there waiting for the two of them to catch up. Like, yes, a sugar beet had come through the windscreen. No, she wasn't hurt. Yes, this other guy did phone the police. Any further questions? I can email you the notes. The younger man looked through the hole in the windscreen and at the windscreen itself and whistled. Actually whistled. This long descending note, like the sound effect of a rock falling towards someone's head in an old film. What was that? "You all right?" he asked her. "You cut or anything? You in shock?" She shook her head. Not that she knew how she would know she was in shock. She was pretty sure one of the symptoms of being in shock would be not thinking you were in shock. Like with hypothermia when you take off your clothes and roll around laughing in the snow. She'd read that somewhere. He looked at the sugar beet and whistled again. "I mean," he said, and now she didn't know if he was talking to her or to the other man. "That could have been fatal, couldn't it?" The other man nodded and said something in agreement. They both looked at her again. "You could have been killed," the younger man said. It was good of him to clarify that for her. She wondered what she was supposed to say. They looked as if they were waiting for her to ask something, to ask for help in some way. "Well, thanks for stopping," she said. They could probably go now, really, if they'd called the police. There was no need to wait. She thought she probably wanted them to go now. "I couldn't just leave you like that, could we?" the younger man said. He looked at her arm. "You're bleeding," he said. "Look." He pointed to the scratches on her arm and she looked down at herself. She could see the blood, but she couldn't feel anything. There wasn't much of it. It could be someone else's, couldn't it? But there wasn't anyone else. It must be hers. And she couldn't feel anything. She looked back at the younger man. "It's fine," she said. "It's nothing, really. Thanks." "No, it might be, though," he said. "It might get infected. You have to be careful with things like that. There's a first aid box in the van. Hang on." He turned and walked back to the van, a blue Transit with the name and number of a landscape gardening company painted across the back, and a little cartoon gardener with a speech bubble saying no job was too small. The doors were tied shut with a length of orange rope. The number plate was splattered with mud, but it looked like a K-reg, K450 something. although she wasn't sure if that was O the number or O the letter. The older man turned and smiled at her while they were waiting, and she supposed that was him trying to be reassuring, but to be honest, it just looked a bit weird. Although he probably couldn't help it. He probably had some kind of condition, like a degenerative eye condition maybe. And then on top of that, which would be painful enough, he had to put up with people like her thinking he looked creepy when he was just trying to be nice. She smiled back. She didn't want him thinking she'd been thinking all that about him looking creepy or weird. "Police will be here in a minute," he said. She nodded. "Florrie must have been overloaded," he said. "Driver's probably none the wiser, even now." "No," she said, glancing down at the sugar beet again. "I suppose not." The younger man came back, waving a green plastic first aid box at her. He looked just as pleased as when he'd held up the phone. She wondered if he was on some sort of special supported apprenticeship or something. He was a little bit learning challenged. And then she thought it was probably discriminatory of her to have even thought that, and she tried to get the thought out of her mind, only you can't get thoughts out of your mind just by trying. That was another one of those Buddhist things. She should just concentrate on not thinking about her breathing instead, she thought. Just total mindlessness, mindfulness. Just breathe.